Every figure, every moment in history, there's this popular narrative about it. And it's a necessary popular narrative. You need to have kind of the elevator speech version of it, right? But then there are all the little nuances, there are all the little moments that give it detail that one would have never imagined. Maybe one moment that could have changed the entire result, and we would have been thinking about this person totally differently.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the About Story podcast. My name is Nathan Johnson, and today I'm joined by Richard Lim. Richard is a fantastic writer and historian, and we're going to talk a little bit about his podcast, This American President. So you have a podcast.
Yes.
And it's about our American presidents.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about how you started with your podcast, or maybe what made you got interested in doing your podcast.
Basically, if you've ever had a friend in like your group, your circle, who would always say, "Oh, did you know that?" and then insert random historical fact, right?
Yeah.
That's me. Basically, ever since I was a kid, I've been in love with history, and it was in the third grade where I started, when my mom would take me to the library. Shout out to my mom. She would take me every Saturday, and I would look up these history books, and I'd get obsessed, and I was, fascinated in them the way kids were fascinated by sports figures or whatever. So that grew into a lifelong love of history. I lived out in Washington, D.C. I'm originally from Orange County. I moved to D.C., and when I was there, I was working in a lot of different jobs, and some of them were jobs that I loved. Some of them were jobs that I hated, just like most people. Right. And about 6 years ago, I was in a job that I absolutely hated. It was horrible. I made the mistake of taking it for the money. Don't do that. And it wasn't aligned with my skill set or interest. And when that happens, you find ways to stay sane. And meanwhile, I loved history as much as ever before. And when I went to DC, I had kind of this idealistic hope that I was going to go do great things, and I would apply my history knowledge to the issues that I would be working on, or whatever I'd be working on. And most jobs, that's just not possible. It's, your job has nothing to do with anything that you learned in history. So it was one of those things where there was kind of a disconnect between what I was learning and how I was applying it. And I thought, what's the point of learning all this stuff, all this history, if you can't share it with people? Mm-hmm. And yes, I could share it with my friends and be, the history guy in the group. It seemed like I wasn't engaging with my history knowledge at all during, the bulk of my day. So a buddy of mine who is really into podcasts. He listens to podcasts. He knows what's interesting and, what makes podcasts compelling. He basically just kind of brought up, hey, why don't you start a podcast? And people I know started kind of mentioning that, more and more people are listening to podcasts. And it was an idea, the seed was planted. And then as I was miserable in my job, you start thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe I could do this on the side. So my buddy, his name's Michael Neal. He basically, he's pretty tech savvy. He basically became the producer of the podcast. And awesome. From there, it literally started out with a rented mic, a microphone that a friend had who also had a podcast of his own, and some software. And we rented out a room in a soundproof room at a library. And those are the humble beginnings of This American President.
Yeah. And now you've been going on for about 6 years?
It's been
now, right?
6 years, yeah.
That's
and
amazing.
we've released about 115 episodes. So yeah, it's grown. It's done well. I would say for two dudes. It's not like we're famous or anything, but for the fact that it's two guys doing our thing, it's running on passion basically.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's gone by really quickly. I mean, it's funny because when I listen to the old episodes, so much has changed since then. My own style has changed, my delivery style. It's just a natural evolution. And the things that people were talking about then just going on in the world are different, than it is now. And so when I listen to those old episodes, it's kind of like going back in time. It's like a time warp and seeing, oh yeah, I forgot about that. I forgot when that was interesting. And we try to not inject too much of what's going on in the world into the episodes, but it happens a little bit. And so a lot of our older episodes kind of speak to those events.
So can you tell me a little bit about the process? So what goes into making an actual episode?
Sure. So the first thing is what subject you're going to cover. So the subjects that I cover are usually those that I personally have an affinity for, a moment in history or a figure that I'm naturally just, very interested, admire very much. Or maybe not admire, maybe just someone who's had a negative influence but is fascinating. The subjects are also just based on what I'm curious about. I mean, there's a lot of, even though I've studied presidents for almost my whole life, there's obviously going to be a lot of things that I don't know about yet. You could study one president for a whole, your whole career, but still not know about the other 44 or 45. So it's often based on what I happen to be interested in.
Yeah, that's one thing that I actually really love about your podcast is you always find like these really special and unique details about the presidents that I had never heard of before. And it's fascinating. It's so fascinating.
They're really, I guess the metaphor, they're like, I don't know if maybe the iceberg metaphor works where, you see a little bit of the top and then, and there's so much more underneath. And the thing about it is that every figure, every moment in history, there's this popular narrative about it. And it's a necessary popular narrative. You need to have kind of the elevator speech version of it, right? But then there are all the little nuances, there are all the little moments that give it detail that one would have never imagined. Maybe one moment that could have changed the entire result, and we would have been thinking about this person totally differently. So for an example, when someone loses the presidency, they're the biggest loser on earth. They have an L on their forehead, right? Is that fair? Maybe, maybe not. But sometimes the election came down to something that they couldn't control, or just one little mistake or something like that. And that little difference is the difference between this person being a historical figure that's very important and a footnote, know. Yet the narrative is just big L, but when you go through it, when you see more, you think, oh, wow, this person actually did a lot more than people give them credit for. There's nothing that replaces just the hard work of doing the research. And one thing I try to do is I try to read, I have a full-time job, so it's not like I can read like 90 books on the subject for every episode, but I try to read multiple books on a given subject, and that usually helps you see this event from the major perspectives. Usually when it comes to a given event, there are at least 2 or 3 major perspectives or narratives regarding this particular historical event. And from there, just reading about, 3 or 4 books, you really start to kind of formulate your own view. You know what this person said on this side of the spectrum and this person said on the other side of the spectrum. And now you can kind of figure out, okay, this is where I kind of land on this. And then from there, you got to just start writing, and you write your scripts. I found that the script writing part is actually easier than the research part. The research part is when you're having to dig through a lot. Yeah. And then kind of formulating a narrative in your own mind. And by the time you're writing, you're executing it, and you're seeing the story there for what it's worth.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because a lot of my audience here, they're like narrative writers.
Sure.
So for you to do this like historical, it's an interesting dynamic, because you're taking actually a real history and you're distilling it into a narrative that people can kind of follow, and you're like looking for, okay, what's the through line? What are the main players in this story?
Right.
And how do I like tell it in an interesting way and bring all the different facts and things together to make it cohesive?
Yeah, and
because you have to choose like what things are you going to leave in, what things are going to leave out, because history, there's so much there.
Yes, there is so much there, and it's one of those things where you can tell the story of a person's life in one episode in a very truncated version. And I've had episodes that cover a whole person's life, and I've had episodes that cover maybe just a handful of months. And they're 2 different styles of writing, but there's always a story there. There's kind of a macro story, there's a micro story. I think that's part of the fun of it. You can see how sometimes you can see how like all these little stories form a wide tapestry of even a wider story. And both versions have validity to it. If you listen to my podcast, you'll know that I have episodes on just one election, 1876. I do an episode on the craziest election in American history, even crazier, some people say, than 2020, because literally the country almost went back into a civil war. And so that's just a handful of months. And then I have another episode on President Andrew Johnson, his whole life covered. And yeah, it really teaches you how to tell a story, but using very, very different time frames.
So when you're looking at the different stories to tell, talked about the research. And can we talk a little bit about like what the writing process looks like? Like, do you write it on your, like, how do you write a script out? Like, what's your first step?
It's funny. I've had jobs where I've had to write sometimes long technical reports, and I've had jobs where I've had to write very short, succinct pieces. So one of my last jobs, I was an op-ed writer, basically a ghost op-ed writer. Most people don't realize that op-eds, just like books, most of them are actually ghost written, not by the person who the final name there, but by some person they paid.
Who actually knows how to write.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, one would hope. And because most of the experts usually are too in the weeds to kind of see how this appeals to, someone that doesn't know anything about it. What I found, I was working at that job the same time I was doing my podcast. That wasn't the job that I hated. This was the job after that. But what I found was that writing something that's shorter is so much harder than writing something that's long.
Why?
Yes, because op-ed writing, short writing, everything has to fit. It has to check all the boxes, right? You have to have the hook, and then from there you have to hit the argument and make it compelling and all that stuff. And you have to do it very succinctly, and all has to be woven together, right? So if you change one part, it's like a Rubik's Cube. If you change one part of it, another part has to change, right? That's what makes it challenging. With podcast writing, or at least the writing that I do, I'm writing these long scripts. You just have a lot more freedom to do it. So I would find after writing an op-ed for the day, I'd be kind of exhausted. And then the podcast scripts was actually therapeutic, because it was so much easier to write and it was free flowing. And I would try to write it in a way that when I spoke, it would sound somewhat conversational. Like it wouldn't sound like I'm reading a Wikipedia article, right? That's obviously something you don't want to do. You want to avoid. Writing the podcast scripts, it's really just thinking out loud. It's just writing what you're thinking. And yeah, it is a script, so you go back and you change stuff and all that stuff, but it just felt so much freer. I think like many writers, most writers would probably say that sometimes getting started is the hardest part. But when you've done your research, when I would start writing, I would just think of, okay, if I'm explaining this to somebody, I would always picture, like I have a relative that I like to talk history with, and I would think, if I was explaining this to her, how would I say it? How would I explain it to someone that doesn't know that much about it, but would be interested in it? How would I explain it? So really, it almost feels kind of easy to write it. It's still a lot of work because it's a lot of, depending on the subject you want to cover, it ends up being a lot to write. But it feels freeing to write that kind of script.
Yeah. How long does it normally take you to write a script?
It's
on the subject, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. I'm a pretty fast writer. What I found is that, people ask, oh, how do you have time to do this and that? And I'm sure people who are writers understand this. It's really surprising how much writing you can get done, research and writing you can get done if you spend your lunch hour doing it and a couple of hours during the week and then a decent chunk of like your afternoon on the weekend. It's really amazing how much you can get done. And so I would say for a given script, I mean, I've been doing series on like a given topic, right? So I'll maybe do like a 2-parter or 3-parter on a president. And each episode is about 30 pages, about an hour long, right? Maybe a little longer. And so 3 episodes will be about 90 to 100 pages. And I could probably do that in maybe 2 or 3 weeks, I would say. But that's, I would say, maybe the first draft. Then it takes me a little bit longer to go through it, reread it, make sure it's what I want, and then recording it and then going through the recordings and all that. So that stuff takes longer. But as far as writing it, you can get the bulk of it done in like less than a month.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you have someone that proofreads it for you, or like do you go over with anybody, or you just kind of do it on your own?
Well, I did, but everything's a bandwidth issue, right? So my producer would kind of look at it too, but he's busy, and editing it was also something that took time. So basically, I was the host, but also the creative content director. So nice fancy title.
So that's awesome, Richard. I'm really impressed with the detail that you go into for your podcast and the amount of research that you do, and it just makes it really come alive. So that's just awesome. So what are some of your favorite episodes that you've worked on?
I've covered a lot of the big ones. We have episodes on Washington, Lincoln, Reagan, FDR. One of the first episodes we did that people really liked was the second episode we released, and it's on President Andrew Johnson. No one knows anything about Andrew Johnson, right? But it's one of my favorite episodes because he's such an interesting figure. First, here you have a guy who came from literally nothing. He was so poor that he was apprenticed as a tailor, didn't go to college. He didn't know how to read until he met the woman who became his wife, and she taught him how to read. From there, he ended up rising in the political ranks, and he's from Tennessee. He rose because he was a supporter of the common man, kind of like Andrew Jackson. Similar names, Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson. This one's on Andrew Johnson. When the Civil War broke out, he did something that no other senator did in the Confederacy when the South seceded. And the whole South was basically, generally speaking, was pretty unified, right? They, 11 states broke off. We're going to form their own country. And Andrew Johnson essentially said, no, I'm not going to leave the Union. I'm going to stick with the Union. He's the only senator to do that. And in one sense, it was a bit courageous. He had his home threatened by people who supported the Confederate cause. People were threatening to kill him. But he stood against secession, and he was the only Southern senator to do that. And he became useful to the North, to the Union, to President Lincoln, because they got to say, look, see, they're not all secessionists. And then when Lincoln ran for re-election, Lincoln was a Republican, the Republicans wanted to show that this was a Union ticket, that the Union transcended party. It wasn't just Democrat or Republican, it was Union. And it was also, when they say Union, not just politically, but Union regionally, not just the North. So they said, how better to show that than to put Andrew Johnson, the Southerner, who supported the Union, on the ticket. So it was a complete political move, right? And he ended up joining the ticket with Lincoln. And lo and behold, a few months into their term together, Lincoln gets assassinated. And now Johnson is president of the United States. So it's kind of this historic accident that led him to becoming president. And then, unfortunately, though, for all of his virtues as, being a courageous person, he was also a pretty horrible person. He was a very racist person. And he had a chip on his shoulder. He hated people who were wealthy. He had just a lot of resentment because he came from poverty. And so after the Civil War, when you had 4 million Black Americans who were suddenly free, they had a person in office, the president, who couldn't care less about their well-being at all. And because of that, because of this very critical time when blacks had just been liberated, what happened then is that's when you had the rise of Jim Crow and all of that stuff. And that pivotal moment has left a legacy for our country. And in many ways, it was obviously a very negative one. It was really because he rose to the presidency, not because of him possibly being a great president. He rose to the presidency because of a political situation in which people didn't think, oh, he'd be a great president in case Lincoln died. But it was, oh, this would allow us to say this is the Union Party, and they won off of that. One specific story about him is that he was sick right before his inauguration as vice president. He actually got sworn in the Capitol building. The president and the vice president got sworn in separate ceremonies. Lincoln got sworn in later outside of the Capitol, just like we do now. Johnson was sworn in the Capitol building, and he was sick. And back then, when you were sick, doctor just said, here's some alcohol, right? So he took some alcohol, and he took a little bit too much alcohol. And so when he was sworn in as vice president, he actually gave an inaugural address. Vice presidents don't give inaugural addresses anymore, but he did. And he was a bit tipsy. And when he was tipsy, he literally just started reaming all the senators that were there, right? So as I said, he came from poverty and he had a chip on his shoulder. And, just like now, a lot of those members of Congress were pretty wealthy. And he was slurring his words, and he was saying, I'm a man of the people, and all you are a bunch of rich kids that grew up, silver spoon in your mouth. And but I look at me now, kind of thing, right? And and Lincoln was right next to him, and he was very embarrassed by what had happened, right? If you look at a photo of Lincoln's second inauguration, and you see him giving the speech. And it's one of the most famous speeches in American history. It's a great speech. Some people say it's even better than his Gettysburg Address, the most famous speech. You can see Andrew Johnson sitting pretty close to Lincoln, right? And he's covering his head. And they said he was covering his head because he was so red that people could tell he was drunk, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Historians are pretty sure that John Wilkes Booth is in the picture as well.
That's crazy.
And he went on, as we all know, to kill Lincoln about a month later, about 5 weeks later. And Lincoln was killed by Booth, but it was a conspiracy because Booth had a group of henchmen who their plan was to actually decapitate the Northern government, to kill Lincoln, to kill Johnson, to kill the Secretary of State. And the plan was that by killing them, the South had already surrendered, but by killing them when they did, it would maybe allow the Civil War to continue, the South to continue the cause, right? Thankfully, that didn't happen. Unfortunately, they did kill Lincoln, as we all know. But in that one photo, they say a picture says 1,000 words, right? In that one photo, you have this little episode, this humorous episode of Andrew Johnson being plastered drunk during his own vice presidential inauguration. And then the man who would go on to kill him and his conspirators all around Lincoln. So to me, that's when I talk about stories, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about those little moments that no one knows about that happened. And if I may, there are a lot of people that say they don't like history. It's boring, right? Maybe they had a history teacher that didn't really teach it in a compelling way. They just shoved a bunch of dates and names and said, memorize this, right? But what I always like to remind people is that history is literally just an aggregate story of humanity. And it's full of, as we said, the micro story and the macro stories, right? What I just said about Booth is a micro story. There are tons of those stories, and that's all history really is. It's just a bunch of stories about a lot of people. It's
all
about,
woven together.
it's about humanity trying to figure itself out, right? And that is usually pretty messy, right? But it's stories about people, about ideas clashing, about great empires. And, sometimes it's the little stories that charm me as well. It's not just about the big figures like Lincoln and Washington. A lot of people don't realize that here's Ulysses S. Grant. He was the 18th president. He was also the top Civil War general, essentially Lincoln's greatest general. But 2 years before the start of the Civil War, he was working. Actually, he wasn't working. He was on the streets of St. Louis selling firewood and looking for work, right? He was really at maybe as low a point as any president had ever been. He actually had to sell his I think it was his watch to buy a present. He had to pawn his watch to get a gift for his family, to get a gift for his wife. He was as low as it got. And then in 1860, he actually crawled back to his family store. It was a leather store. And he went to his younger brothers, or it was his dad, crawled back to him. He was already in his late 30s by this point. And he was begging for work. So he's working under his younger brothers, which, that's pretty humiliating, right? Imagine if you're, begging your younger brother for work. But that's where he was. 5 years later, he was the top general of the Civil War. And 3 years after that, he was elected president of the United States.
Wow.
Right? If you look at the presidential rankings, you see, Grant, low-ranking president, whatever, right? But those rankings can't even tell you the little nuances of his story. When you look at the first paragraph of Wikipedia, that's all most people know, right? This guy was great. This guy was horrible. This guy served during this war, whatever. But I like to find those little stories in there that really show you who a person is.
Yeah, and it's so much more nuanced than I think people would like it to be. Like, we like to think, this is a good person, this is a bad person.
Right.
But the reality is most people are a lot more in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
And we're shades of gray. And, obviously there's things, people have done really good things and people have done really horrible things. Mm-hmm. But as a person, we're very complex creatures.
Yes. And
the morality and the things and the issues that we go through, everything is all very complex.
Yes.
And I think from a storytelling standpoint, whether it's, fiction or nonfiction, those are the stories that will resonate with people, are the stories of a person who has moral dilemmas, and there's conflict and there's intrigue and there's change. Mm-hmm. That's what it's like, I resonate with that.
And that's something, fiction and nonfiction reflect each other in many ways, right? There's a lot of historical fiction out there. There's also just period pieces, or books written at any period of time will reflect that period of time, and they'll reflect the characters of, maybe the author knew someone that was like that. And so when you study real figures, you see those same kind of archetypes and complexities.
Yeah. I'd love to talk a little bit about your documentary that you were on. So you were interviewed for, I believe it was a CBS documentary?
Actually, History Channel.
Oh, History Channel, yeah. So it was a History Channel documentary.
Yes. I think it was on my LinkedIn. I get contacted by someone who is essentially a producer. Basically, she invited me to participate in a documentary series. Now, I had actually participated in one before, but it was more as a consultant, and I didn't end up going in front of camera. But in this case, they interviewed me, and what happened was, so they're producing this documentary on President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it was Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is one of the most well-known historians in the field. She's been around for decades, and she was essentially producing a series of documentaries on the big ones: Washington, Lincoln, Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. So this was, I think it was the fifth one. Obviously, there are more big ones than that, but those were the ones they were doing. And they invited me to participate in this. And it's interesting because I've gone through different phases. When I first got into presidents, I actually got into presidents when I was a kid because there were all these JFK documentaries. People are fascinated by JFK. And when I was 8, the movie JFK came out, right? And the conspiracy stuff, all those documentaries, are so interesting. I had a phase where that was, he was the most interesting president to me. And then in high school, I got interested in FDR. And so I had that phase. And then I've since moved on from him. I studied him, things I like about him, things I don't like about him. Then I got into Lincoln. Now I'm into Washington. It had been a while since I had really gotten into FDR. I mean, he's always been a very interesting person. Lots of things that he did that I like, that I didn't like. I studied him, and it was kind of like a nostalgia trip, right? Going back to study him. So basically, they invited me to fly to New York City and participate in this History Channel interview where they would interview me, and they gave me a sheet on all the topics they would cover. And it was literally everything from his entire life, right? And in recent years, I've done FDR episodes, but I've mainly focused on a very specific period in his life, namely his last year and a half alive. It was like, oh crap, I got to get up to speed on this, right? So I ended up basically, studying, and I didn't have that much time. I had a few weeks, right? What I actually ended up doing, this is probably cheating, but what I ended
Wikipedia, right?
Yeah, no, not Wikipedia. What I ended up doing is that I reached out to a ton of friends who like history, and I basically said, look, this is more stuff to cover than I have time to do it. Can you help me? Can you help me with this particular section? I gave them different sections of his life, and just give me basically a short fact sheet on each one, like a little brief. So I outsourced it. Basically, I outsourced it to a bunch of people. All of them ended up getting a nice gift card for Barnes & Noble. But anyways, it was great because I ended up getting this big outline on his whole life, notes on his whole life, and I just spent the last week just studying it, making sure I knew. But it's one of those things where I could tell you a lot about FDR, but then you had to know all these little details, like tell me what his wedding was like. And it's like, well, I know he married Eleanor Roosevelt. I could give you a approximate date, but I couldn't tell you what kind of flowers they had there, or the details. So that kind of stuff I had to outsource in terms of research.
Yeah, it is interesting kind of knowing what details to leave in and what details are not as important.
Right, but it was like studying for a test. You don't know what they're going to ask, right? They had me stay in this hotel, and then they had rented out space. First of all, it was great. It was fun to go to New York City. I don't go too often, but I flew across the country from Southern California, and they basically had me meet them at this random building, and what they do is that they have to find a building where there isn't too much noise, right? It's New York City, it's a pretty noisy place, right? So anyways, went to a relatively peaceful area, and they just started interviewing me, and most of the stuff I knew pretty well. So some of the questions they had to kind of guide me through and say, this is kind of what we're looking for. But I felt pretty good. I felt pretty confident. They were very positive. They responded positively to what I said. But yeah, it was kind of a surreal experience, and just kind of meeting the people who do these documentaries, and I had grown up watching documentaries on history, for years. So being able to kind of, this is the guy who does it. This is the person. And, it doesn't just happen. You need someone to do all this stuff. So yeah, just being a part of that process was very cool.
Did that inspire you at all? Like, do you think you'd want to do like film documentaries in the future, perhaps?
I don't know if, as far as doing a documentary, I think that would kind of have to be just like a long-term thing. Right now, focusing on the podcast and focusing on some different book ideas, because I think if you're a historian, at some point you have to write a book, right?
For sure, yeah.
And right now, I've written, I would say like the length of multiple books, but for the podcast,
Right.
and I'm my own editor, so I haven't gone through that process. But
It seems like you get pretty easily kind of distill it down into a book form because you have so much content already, right?
sure, yeah, but finding a publisher for a book, I'm sure as anyone who wants to find a publisher for a book, you kind of have to get it approved, and it's all based on the market and what
Right.
people are interested in reading. So I've talked to a publisher about publishing a book before. It didn't work out, but I did do a book proposal. Yeah, who knows? We'll see. But hey, as far as documentaries, if more places, production companies would love to have me, to be interviewed for that, I definitely love doing that. Most of those people were published historians, so I think I might have been like the token podcaster or something, which is pretty cool. Tried to represent well, but it was a great experience, and I waited over a year. In fact, it was actually the documentary was supposed to come out on Memorial Day of this year, so I got interviewed in June of last year, so it was about a year, right? And you get excited, and but you also have to be patient. And then I pinged them about it later just to see what was going on. They actually said they were going to delay it to being released. I think it was supposed to be released on President's Day this year, and it ended up getting pushed to Memorial Day. So it was released Memorial Day, and I had no idea how much they would use from the footage. I mean, I was there for like hours. They interviewed me for hours, and they asked on everything from the early part of his presidency, of his life to his death. And they ended up having me in the documentary for about a few minutes. So it's a 3-parter. If you look at the first episode, I'm in it talking about the 1912 election when FDR was a lot younger. I don't remember exactly what part, but yeah, I'm in it in the 3rd episode, near the end actually. So it was pretty cool to see that, and I had a lot of friends watching it. So
yeah, sounds like a great experience.
It was a great experience. Yeah, it was very cool.
For sure. Yeah.
So
I was noticing your shirt. I just wanted to comment. I thought the picture is so cool. Can you tell me a little bit about like where that design came from? And
so I can't take too much credit for it because I have very little design artistic ability. Originally, our first logo, my producer Michael, and the running gag is that, so I call him my producer because it sounds cool, but I'm my producer, and then my wife is like, you mean Michael? Like he's he's good at all that stuff, and having a vision and all that. So when we just needed to create a logo, he literally just took 3 pictures of presidents. He took Washington, Lincoln, and Kennedy, and he made it kind of like the black and white, I guess more like sepia tone, and then just with the words "This American President." So it's like 4 squares with the 3 presidents and the word "This American President," and it was pretty good, for a first logo. But then we wanted something a little bit more a little bit more our brand, right? So we actually hired an artist. His name is Nip Rogers. So shout out to Nip Rogers if you're watching. And we actually were looking through different images. And the one image that I really liked, there's a famous image of President Kennedy. And Kennedy was president during the height of the Cold War. And basically this concept of the president, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Really, the Cold War was when people talked about presidents as the most powerful man in the world, right? And it was, the president had the nuclear football. He could, cause nuclear war. He could destroy all of civilization, right? And Kennedy dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is this event where the world almost, became a nuclear parking lot, right? And there's this photo of JFK in the Oval Office, and it's basically he's at the desk, and his shoulders are kind of hunched over, and he's looking at something, and it's a view from behind, and it's black and white, and it's like kind of almost looks like a silhouette, and you could see Kennedy's figure, and he's looking down at the desk. You know, his hands are kind of like this at the desk. He's standing, and it's a photo that has conveyed to many people the burden of the presidency. You know, and it's a nice symmetrical image. You know, in the middle of the oval, and that's what it conveyed. So I was thinking of something like that, but we actually found another image that kind of speaks to that, but it's not quite the same thing. And there was a president. I don't want to say which president because everyone gets triggered by, you know, who they are. And it wasn't Trump. So, you know, I know, you know, but it was another president relatively recently that some people love and some people hate, just like most presidents now. And there's a picture of him standing on or sitting on the Oval Office desk right here. So he's actually doing this. And it was the closest equivalent that we could find that also conveyed that, because the Kennedy one, I think the problem with it is that if you do an artistic version of it, it's kind of hard to tell what it is, right? But here where you can actually see the president, and it's a generic president. We literally just created some guy that kind of looks kind of like approximates the stereotype of what a president looks like. So that, and we basically gave it to Nip Rogers, and he turned it into this. And then when he gave us this copy, we were looking through it, being the perfectionists we are, and you know, this needs to be different, that needs to be different. And I think I remember Michael was kind of looking at it for every little detail, like stuff I didn't even notice, you know. And at some point he was like, you know what, it's never going to be perfect. Let's just do it, you know. So we uploaded it, and that's the logo right there.
I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I'm pretty proud of it. Yeah, it's funny because I actually think that the generic president depicted here looks almost more like a person, a former candidate who actually lost the presidency than actually any of the presidents. So, you know, I mean, you kind of, I don't know, like if people look at it, they can kind of decide who they think that is. But we tried to make it generic. So.
Yeah. Probably a smart choice.
Right. Yeah.
You also do interviews with your podcast as well. So some of it's written, and then you also interview people for your podcast. Can you talk about that a little bit?
When we released our episodes, they were all the long form narrative format, me talking basically. But eventually people start saying, oh, you should interview this person or that person, right? So, and then people actually started pitching for them to be interviewed on our podcast. And it became a great opportunity to showcase their story as well. You know, the guests have a story, just to kind of provide variety and supplement the information. And honestly, to just get some pretty cool guests. One of the first guests we had was a woman who was Ronald Reagan's personal assistant. And she had great stories. In fact, she was his assistant after he had announced he had Alzheimer's. So that was the time when he was fading from the public eye, and most presidents do. You know, there was almost additional layer of secrecy there. Basically, she got to see him as fewer and fewer people got to see him. You know, and she got to see the times in his life when, you know, the world had kind of moved on from his presidency, kind of seeing who the 40th president was through the eyes of this woman she was a young woman at the time. I believe she was in her 20s, but she got to work for President Reagan, who she admired a great deal. And so it was a very personal story, and hearing her story was amazing. We interviewed, and at the time I lived in the Washington, D.C. area, which was great because you can just go to an event and you're bound to meet somebody who has a cool story, right? So I was at an event for my day job, and I was talking to the photographer who was, you know, doing photos for the event, and it had nothing to do with presidents. And we were talking, and I asked him, oh, you know, when did you get into photography? And ends up he got into photography because his dad was a photographer, and it ends up his dad was the photographer at the White House. So he had been the photographer for multiple presidents. And when you're a photographer, you get to know these presidents. So he knew Eisenhower, he knew Kennedy, he knew Johnson. So, and his son, the guy that I was talking to, had met all these presidents. And I'm not to be morbid, but he had taken photos involving the assassination of President Kennedy. So there's a story there. I got to interview the former director of the CIA, Mike Hayden, which was incredible. You know, he was a professor by then, the CIA director during the Bush years. So, you know, post 9/11, during and post 9/11. He was the NSA director and CIA director. So by then he was a professor. So, you know, he's a bit more accessible. Got to interview him. I interviewed one of the astronauts on Apollo 13.
Wow.
Which was very cool. Fred Hayes, American hero. I've always been fascinated by space. So meeting him was amazing. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, he's played by Bill Paxton. And recently, one of the coolest interviews I got to do was with Clint Hill, who was the Secret Service agent who was closest to Kennedy when Kennedy was shot and killed. Wow. So he gone through rough times after that, naturally. Those poor Secret Service agents blamed themselves for what happened. It wasn't their fault, but they blamed themselves. And he struggled with a lot of demons, but overcame them. He didn't want to tell the story and relive the most traumatic experience of his life, but he was eventually convinced that for the historical record, he owed it to the country to do so. So he began writing books, and he wrote a new book and was able to get him, interview him for that. These are people that have lived the events that I've read about. And to me, again, it goes back to the story, right? This is a person's story. When an event happens, it's not just something in a textbook. It's like people are living that event. One of the coolest stories, actually, this is one of my favorite stories to share. Ronald Reagan, when he became president in 1981, January of 81. 2-3 months later, it was March, he was at a hotel in D.C. giving a speech. And when he was done, he walked out of the hotel with his staff, Secret Service, and was about to go into the limo, waved to the crowd. Shots are fired, right? So for most people who studied Reagan, they'll be familiar with the fact that there was an assassination attempt on Reagan. And what happened was, and there's footage of this, you go on YouTube and watch it, and basically shots were fired. Immediately, the agent behind Reagan shoves him into the limo, and they speed off. Chaos ensues. A few of Reagan's staffers are hit. A few Secret Service agents are hit. Gunman is apprehended. What happened was that the agent who was with Reagan, a man named Jerry Parr, saw that, he first told the driver, go to the White House because it's most secure location. But then he saw Reagan was coughing blood, and it's, code red, whatever the phrase is, rawhide down. Rawhide was Reagan's Secret Service code. And he recognizes that the president is hit. So they direct the driver to go to GW Hospital, George Washington Hospital. They get there, and the bullet had ricocheted. It had ricocheted off the car, and the part that hit him was like a disc. The bullet was actually a disc. It was like and it had gone into Reagan, and it was a slit. So, most gunshot wounds, the whole bullet goes in you, and it's does a lot of damage, right? But it was a little disc, and it was a slit. So it wasn't causing as much of blood loss initially. It was hard to identify, but then they realized he was hit. The president was hit. Huge deal. And Reagan was a pretty strong guy, but he insisted on trying to walk into the hospital, right? But at some point, he lost half of his blood supply, right? And he was a 69-year-old man. He was oldest president up till then. As the story goes, he gets, the doctors, he gets to the hospital, the doctors treat him, and thankfully they save his life, right? And he makes all these jokes, he tells Nancy, oh, I forgot to duck, and then he looked around at the doctors, and he said to them, I hope you're all Republicans, and the head doctor, who was a liberal Democrat, said to him, Mr. President, today we're all Republicans, right? So a lot of wonderful aspects of this story, and the guy, he ended up surviving, right? And the agent who did all the quick thinking, who shoved him into the limo, his name was Jerry Parr, and who identified that he was shot, got them to the hospital. He was later given all sorts of commendations because this guy essentially saved the life of the president, right? And this was less than 2 decades after the Kennedy assassination. So had they lost another president, maybe the Secret Service doesn't protect the president anymore. Maybe it's another agency. But anyways, this guy Jerry Parr was appropriately recognized for what he did. And he actually... Later on, he told President Reagan, he said, Mr. President, you actually had something to do with your own salvation, your own surviving the assassination. What do you mean? He said, well, the reason I'm a Secret Service agent was because when I was a boy, my dad would take me to the movies and, these matinees. There was a movie I watched that inspired me to be a Secret Service agent. It's called Code of the Secret Service. And guess who was the star of that movie? Ronald Reagan, right? Actor, right? Right. Which you have to think about it. Imagine if you're this kid, you watch this movie, and you're like, wow, that's really cool. It's about a Secret Service agent. I want to be Secret Service agent. You become a Secret Service agent, and that the star of that movie, you see him become governor and then become president, and then you're guarding him. I mean, the guy, and
you save his life.
Yeah, and then you save his life. And one of the great ironies of it is, Reagan, apparently he laughed and he said, that was the worst movie I ever did. That was the worst movie. So anyways, I say that whole story because so Jerry Parr has passed away, American hero, but I had the privilege of interviewing his widow for the podcast. They ended up writing a book together, and she's still alive, and I got to interview her, and she had all sorts of great stories. That's one of my favorite episodes, actually. Interviewing the big names was great, but interviewing this woman who, extraordinary woman. Her husband was an extraordinary man, and the fact that they have this story where he saved the life of the president. He was inspired by that president in the first place. But also, she had tons of other stories because her husband started working for the service, I think, under Kennedy. So I think he was around for the Kennedy assassination. He was around for the Nixon resignation and all that. So again, history is just stories.
Awesome, Richard. Wow, that's such an incredible story. I feel like it feels like a movie. Like that would be like a movie.
And there are many more stories like that.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
And on our podcast, we have those kind of stories.
Yes. Well, definitely, guys, check out this podcast, This American President. And thank you, Richard, so much for being on the show. I really appreciated it. And I've gotten to know you a little bit, over the years. And you're just a really stand-up guy. And I just love your love of history. And I love how you're able to effectively communicate that to other people and share that love with other people, and those rich stories, those real, true stories that you make it come alive. So keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, and thank you for having me on the podcast.
You're welcome. Awesome.